Morning. Pat, welcome. It's a smaller panel this year than historically.
Consolidation.
How's business?
Look, I think the word of the week, I think, for me is stability, right? We've obviously come out of a very deep, elongated downturn. Latter part of the last decade, we saw really sort of a hockey stick return in demand, 2020, 2021, and spent much of 21 and 22 reactivating the stored fleet, transitioning aircraft out of storage and between operators, and really getting our inactive fleet back to work. And that was a lot of heavy lifting, particularly from our technical team, to get those aircraft back operating, back utilized. And that body of work, I think, has predominantly been done by 23. And really through 24 and 25, we've seen the market stabilize. And I think stability is a good word in that the volatility that we saw in the early part of the last decade with the orders that were placed and the exuberance that all of us were involved in really crashed down when the bubble burst. I don't think we need that kind of exuberance again. So from our perspective, we'll take stability for now.
So this August is the 15th anniversary of the launch of Milestone. You came into the business 10 years ago this year when GE acquired it. Is that the biggest lesson that the industry needs to learn, is stability?
Look, I think, one of my predecessors used to like to use this forum to stand up there, I think, and on the pulpit of any investor and preach the gospel according to Milestone. That's not particularly my style.
And it wasn't always very popular either.
No, exactly. But I think, look, at what I can look back on is, as you said, the 15 years where we've been one of the industry leaders here and the 10 years that I've been involved in the business. And I think before we look at sort of the lessons that were learned, I think it's important, a lot of water has passed, a lot of time has passed since the downturn. So I think it's important to remind ourselves exactly what triggered that in the first place. And it wasn't mistakes by financiers, it wasn't mistakes or overproduction, particularly by the OEMs. It was driven by a geopolitical shock, which was an oil price, which itself was driven by a price war between the Saudis and shale. So that was the trigger for the downturn. Now, were there other things around that which exacerbated that downturn? Absolutely there was. And when I look at lessons, I think the biggest lesson was around assumptions. Collectively as an industry, if you go back to 2014, 2015, we assumed that there was going to be annual growth in offshore oil and gas of between 4 and 10%, with 4 being the bear case and 10 being the bull case. There was no assumption that it was going to be negative. And I think that assumption then fed into all our modeling in terms of what aircraft are required, what the OEM should build, what we should order, what the industry should finance. And that assumption was incorrect. I think the second assumption which was incorrect was, we all know this game is cyclical, but we assumed that in a downturn, although exploration would dry up and that would lead to a reduction in demand, assets that were serving production platforms were going to be stable. They're a long-term production platform. There was no reason for demand for helicopters for those platforms to reduce. That assumption turned out to be incorrect. So I think if we look back and talk about, well, what is the big lesson that we learned, I think from my perspective, the big lesson is, let's just be careful about our assumptions. Because when we get them wrong, it doesn't impact just my company or one of the OEMs, it impacts the entire industry. And I think that's the big lesson I take from the last downturn.
I think one of the assumptions when you go back to 2015 was also once a helicopter was on a route, it would never be, once it was on a contract, it didn't matter who the operator is, it would stay on it as well. That was another example.
Yeah, example of where we got assumptions wrong.
It is a very finely balanced market, with supply and demand. Are you worried that, people will start to forget them, the lessons?
I think if you continue the theme, right, if you look at a lot of the discussion we had here last year, and I think some of the discussion we're going to have here this year, there's nobody in this room that's assuming we're going to grow offshore demand by 5, 6, 7, 8, 9%. We're all too smart for that. But there is still an embedded assumption that there is going to be strong demand for what we're calling replacement capacity. And underlying that is that really starting from next year, from 2026 onwards, large quantities of S92s are just going to disappear from the market. And that the orders that are being placed right now and the production that the OEMs are planning for is just going to replace those S92s, and therefore we're not going to fall into the trap we fell in historically in terms of oversupplying the market. Now, we know that that transition is coming, that super medium transition is coming. I think in the last 12 months, we're probably the largest buyer of super medium aircraft. We're going to be part of it. We're going to be part of managing that transition. We're also the biggest owner of the S92, and we model supply demand as much as we can based on all the data that we get, and I can tell you we do not know when those aircraft are going to exit. Other than pull an arbitrary number based on vintage out of the air, it's very, very difficult to say when those transitions will happen. And again, if you're assuming 10, 20 odd plus S92s are going to just disappear from 2027 onwards and be replaced by super mediums, and they don't, that's a lot of capacity. And I think we could be very close to tripping back into an oversupplied market if, again, that assumption is incorrect.
Okay, and please feel free to ask questions. We want to make this as interactive, so use Slido, or we can get a mic to you relatively quickly. Are you seeing, we're talking about the replacement demand and the balance there. Are you seeing any hotspots? Are you seeing any demand from operators in different regions or missions?
Yeah, I think I think demand in offshore oil and gas is reasonably robust, not just for new aircraft. I think for our existing fleet, as I said, we're currently, near as makes no difference, 100% utilized on all our aircraft. So all our 92s are out, all our super mediums, all our 139s, right? That's a lot of aircraft. So I think demand is relatively robust. In terms of hotspots, I think Brazil certainly is one of the growth areas, and that is a market which is actually growing as opposed to just swapping types or swapping operators or swapping helicopters. There's significant tangible growth there. I think if you look at some of the more mature markets in the North Sea, Norway, Australia, there's been a lot of activity, but not a lot of growth. So again, we've seen some 92s replaced by 175s. We've even seen 189s been replaced by 175s, which is somewhat bizarre in Australia, but very little incremental demand. So I think it's steady state, as I said at the start. I think it's stability in offshore. In some of the other missions, certainly we're seeing growth as well. EMS continues to particularly in Europe, to grow. Demand is very, very strong across all the countries and all the types. 169, 145, 139, all those types are performing very, very well in EMS missions. And then, we continue to develop the utility sector. And again, I think firefighting, et cetera, they're going to be growth areas on a go-forward basis for rotary assets.
Okay, we'll come back to firefighting. Before the acquisition, a lot of the banks in this room were financing Milestone, and Milestone sourced a lot of debt. And I remember talking to one who was really annoyed it had been repaid because it ruined his year. AerCap sources a lot of debt for fixed wing. Could we see you guys returning to the helicopter debt market?
Well, I think we've certainly seen a lot more interest from financial institutions in financing rotary assets as the market has recovered, as you would expect. And we do talk to a lot of the banks. There's a good few in this room. I think we've got a panel coming up, which I'm very interested to listen to as well. But for now, as you said, we really have the advantage of the large-scale debt complex that AerCap has to raise secured and unsecured debt. And the speed at which we can access that, I think, is a competitive advantage for Milestone as a company. So although we will look, I think, in the future at potentially looking at our own debt raises, it's not something we're going to do in the short term. Now, that said, leverage is important for the industry, right? So even if we are not going to access the debt markets ourselves in the short term, we do believe that it's important that leverage is available to players in the industry. That facilitates trading. It facilitates, the industry maturing to where it needs to in terms of asset trades, et cetera, et cetera. So we're certainly very motivated to continue to talk to the banks, continue to educate them on our view on the market.
Before you went to Milestone, you were in fixed wing. And what one thing would you tell a bank is different about helicopters? If you're financing what's different about financing a helicopter lessor versus a fixed-wing lessor?
Well, I think fixed wing right now has become so commoditized. It is, one, the returns are very, very tight in terms of lease rate factors. But in addition, unless you're at real scale, there isn't a huge amount of value in platforms. So it's very easy to start a fixed wing leasing company, get a bit of capital behind you, put aircraft out on lease for 10 years and don't look at them. You don't need the large, complex infrastructure that, let's say, an AerCap has or some of our other competitors. I think regardless of the size of your portfolio in commercial in helicopter leasing, you need asset experts. You need expertise. So when you're lending to a platform, you should be looking at the depth of knowledge and expertise and experience within that platform, as well as the asset.
And it's probably harder to get that expertise.
And it is much thinner on the ground, exactly.
One of the big transactions, or two transactions you did last year, was the Equinor and Vår Energy. Do you see other energy companies? We've talked about this for years, actually, about energy companies ordering helicopters. It's finally happened. Is this the start of a trend?
Well, I think we have some of the Vår and Equinor teams in the room today, and I should say that the innovation around this transaction is their innovation. It's not our innovation. They had the foresight to place those orders in the first place. We talked about it this time last year. I think when I was sitting here last year, I said I didn't believe that a lot of those orders would end up on the oil company balance sheets, and as it has turned out, that's correct. But is this a trend? I don't think it will take over the entire space. I think it is, if you look at the investment that some of these oil companies put into these large offshore installations, in certain circumstances, they are aware that that platform will be there for the next 15 or 20 years. They are aware that they will require helicopter lift to get to that, and that right now, the helicopters that are currently available are probably the helicopters that are going to service that for the next decade at least. So in those scenarios, it makes sense if you're sitting in contingency planning in an energy company that you have control of a certain amount of assets you need to service your platforms. So if you look like an airline, like a commercial airline, you're going to look at your product mix, you're going to say, well, I need X amount on my balance sheet, I need X amount that I've got leased for long term, I need X amount that I've got leased for short term, and then probably, at the extreme end, you've got short-term engine leases that you might be leasing for 60 or 90 days, right? I think all of those products have a place in rotary, but it's important then that they're all priced correctly. So the helicopter that you're going to lease for a year is going to be significantly more expensive than the helicopter you're going to lease for 10 years. And the helicopter that is going to be leased to an operator on a short-term basis is going to be priced differently to a direct lease to an oil company. I do think that oil companies, through the squeeze in supply that we saw as the market reactivated, as I said, in the start of this decade, did become concerned about continuity and availability of aircraft, and that led to the direct orders that we saw. I think we will see some more of it, but if we see supply pour into the market, there's going to be less of a concern on their side, less motivation for them to continue with some of these structures. So
if you're going to guess, I think airlines are above 50% now on operating leasing. Are we thinking, maybe 5-10% of the offshore fleet could have been originally ordered by a...
I think that's probably about right. Maybe 10% could be originally ordered or directly leased to an end user.
Okay, you talked about oil and gas. Last year, you got your STC for the S92 Fire. For the S92A.
Yep.
What demand have you seen?
Well, we're still in the introductory phase of the aircraft. So it flew, as part of its certification, it flew in Canada and British Columbia last year, dropped water. We have some nice pictures, but they were on real contracts. That was a real firefighting contract. That aircraft is going to be deployed again with VIH in Canada very soon. Again, a lot of this we're building up the knowledge, the data that we require for a full rollout of the fleet. Certainly VIH have ordered a number of those tanks for their own fleet as well. So I do think we're going to see the S92 move into that space really over the next 4 or 5 years. Right now, we developed this tank and this product with a view towards the future, right? So as I said, practically all our S-92s are currently out on lease operating in offshore or search and rescue missions at the moment. I think they'll likely stay there for the foreseeable. But it's as we look out towards the end of the decade and when that transition happens that I think you're going to see more and more demand for the 92 as a firefighting helicopter. It's not a replacement for what's there today. It does different things, right? So yes, it drops water, but it can carry passengers. It's fully certified to carry packs, drop firefighters, drop water. So it's a complementary product, I would say, to the firefighting fleet rather than any replacement product.
And if I'm a bank in the room who, is finance fixed wing, I'd look at it like a cargo conversion, to a 737, which you guys had a cap.
Yeah, it's a secondary mission, right? And I think if you look at exactly like we did with 737s or 777s at AirCap, the aircraft runs for its primary life to 15, 16, 17, 20 years of age, depending on the optimal time to convert. And then we take it out of its primary mission, re-roll it, and cargo convert it for a secondary mission. And this is exactly what we're doing with the 92.
Great. We've got some audience questions before we get to the historic ones. We've got one here from the UK Competition Authority. Please comment on the consolidation of the helicopter lessors and what impact will be on the market.
Look, overall, I think consolidation is good, right? Fragmentation isn't great. So without going into specifics, I think where the platform that was up for sale by Macquarie last year landed, I think is a good spot for the industry. It's in hands of people who think the same way as we think about industry. They're disciplined stewards of capital. It's not a big, put it on steroids and grow it type of play. So overall, I think if that platform is going to trade, we'd be quite happy if it landed where it's supposed to land.
Very diplomatic, just because Crispin's sitting there. There's often a trend where you see one deal, where you see one platform come up and trade. Do you think we're going to see any others?
There's not a lot at scale out there, right?
There's one I can think of.
So, I don't think there's going to be any major trades in terms of platforms in the near future.
Okay, here's a question. These are all anonymous, but that was from the Competitions Authority. This is from Airbus. You've placed the H225 offshore. Do you see demand for that aircraft in the offshore market?
Look, I think we're a big owner of the 225. We transitioned that aircraft out of offshore 2016 when we had to, mainly into utility missions, predominantly with Air Center in Texas, and they've been very successful operating that aircraft. We have had the aircraft operating in offshore missions in China, so this isn't the first move. And as you said, we've moved the aircraft now, and we've got one which is going to operate in Namibia in offshore oil and gas. So is there demand? Yes, but there is demand at a price point, which is still particularly low. That aircraft will be doing exploration missions. It's on relatively short-term contracts. We think that there will be demand for 225s in that space. That's very different from saying, is there a demand for a new $25 million, $30 million 225? If that's the question, I would say in offshore, no, there isn't at the moment.
Okay, and here's a question, anonymous again, but I'm guessing from Bell. You said the H175 is replacing S92s and 189s. Is there space of volumes of the 525?
Well, I think the aircraft has to be certified first, right? So at the moment, Bell haven't quite got there yet. Is there space? It's going to be a niche product. Obviously, Equinor have an order in, and once the aircraft is certified, I fully anticipate that they'll deliver that aircraft, and Equinor will use it, and it'll be quite a good aircraft in the field. As a financier, what I struggle with is how that aircraft gets to scale, and it's very difficult for us to see how you get 100 plus units of that aircraft sold, which is what we would need to be able to say that that is a leasable asset in that you can transition it from one operator to another. And the risk would be that you end up with something which is not very liquid and therefore not an operating lease product. If we look across three platforms, 189, 175, and 525, is there room for all three? I don't think so, is the short answer.
Okay. Do we have any other questions, old school questions, or last chance to put them on slide A? Okay, every year we've always, I think for about the last 10 years, we've asked everyone to score the market like a school grade. What would you give the helicopter market now?
Well, I don't know how good your record keeping is, Al, but whatever I gave it last year, I think I'd give it this year because, as I said, the word of the day is stability, right? So I think the last 12 months have been, stably boring, which I will take in this industry all day long.
That's great. We should use that to advertise the conference. Okay, what grade would you give Milestone? Last year you gave it an E. No, you didn't.
Look, as I said, I think it's been the level of activity that we've had through the business over the last 2 or 3 years has just been at levels which I'm not sure how we sustain them, to be quite honest. And I can see our head of technical, Kieran, is there looking at me, nodding. Last year was no different. We had a lot of activity, much more transitions, more new aircraft deliveries than what we had previously. So as I said, in the last couple of years, it's been all about reactivating aircraft, getting them back in the air. This year, we've been back, at the doors of the OEMs, taking delivery of aircraft that we've purchased and leased back to generally. So I think, again, I would sort of maybe echo what I said last year, which is probably a 9.
And does Kieran get a holiday?
And Kieran is not allowed to take holidays.
Okay, boringly stable is the takeaway for everyone. You started your career in credit. You spend, once you're a credit person, you're always a credit person. Is there anything niggling away?
Look, I think as we look out over probably the next 3 or 4 years, the concerns are around what I touched on at the top, right? Is the biggest biggest destroyer of capital we saw in the industry was a direct result of overcapacity. So what keeps me awake at night is do we slip back into overcapacity? If you look at fixed wing, again, with the comparison, Airbus are building 60 A320s a month. Boeing are back up to about 40 Maxes a month, 100 aircraft a month, 1,200 aircraft a year. If somebody does an order for 150 aircraft, it's not going to hugely move the needle in terms of supply-demand dynamics in fixed wing. But our industry is much, much smaller, right? It's tiny by comparison, and it is very, very easy to slip into that oversupply situation. And it doesn't take 20 aircraft. It only takes 5. And you chase that 5 all around the world on every opportunity, and suddenly you're in a spiral of pricing that starts to drop. Then ultimately, the investment case doesn't make sense anymore, and we're back to where we were. So I think the risk guy in me, that's what I look at in terms of, are we heading back towards something like that? And that ignores the obvious macroeconomic volatility and geopolitical volatility that we're looking at the moment across the board.
Okay, so it wasn't a cheery ending, but it was better than saying boringly stable. Thanks so much, Pat.
Thank you very much.